Vladimir Putin does not view the Alaska summit as diplomacy. In the eyes of the Russian dictator, it's a psychological operation. Putin is not going to go to Alaska as a statesman, but as a career KGB operative running an influence mission. Every movement, every phrase, every glance will be calculated carefully to pressure his opponent and to control the situation. Then he will operate to control the version of events that leaves the room. Because for Vladimir Putin, the meeting itself is the battlefield. The conversation is the weapon, and the perception that arises from it is the prize. My name is Jason Smart. I'm a special correspondent for the Kiev Post here in Kiev, Ukraine. And I'm also an expert on the Putin regime, having written my graduate and doctoral dissertations about it. Now, many years ago, when I was still just 24, I was put on the Kremlin's blacklist for life due to my active work against the Putin regime. They determined that I was a threat to Russian national security. So it's very important to understand, when we talk about Vladimir Putin, how he sees these sorts of meetings, these sorts of summits. In the eyes of Vladimir Putin, they are controlled battlefields. In his worldview, diplomacy is a continuation of war, where the goal is not mutual understanding, but weakening the opponent and gaining leverage. And Vladimir Putin is uniquely well trained to do that. As a career KGB officer, he was trained in active measures, which is aktivnie мероприятия in Russian. That's the Soviet doctrine that foreign policy is a tool to manipulate adversaries and to shape global perception. Now, Western leaders generally talk about having shared values and rules-based order. In the eyes of the Russians, that's stupid. That's a weakness. That is a vulnerability to be exploited. However, very rarely, when the Western press analyzes these summits, these sorts of meetings, do they even bother to examine how the Russian side is perceiving these talks? Which is precisely why I created this channel, to discuss what is really happening within the Putin regime and what the Kremlin is next planning. This is all with the objective of getting out the truth to more people of what is happening here in Ukraine and what is really happening within Moscow. So, incredibly enough, this channel has far surpassed my own expectations. We now have over 190,000 subscribers in less than 3 months. So if you'd like to help me reach 200,000 subscribers in less than 3 months, and more importantly, to help me to get this message that is so important for Ukraine, to get to the world of what's really happening here and the truly evil intentions of the Putin regime to more people, please, I ask you to do me one favor, cost you nothing, but helps me greatly. Please like this video, please subscribe to this channel, and consider becoming a channel member today. Thank you. So in order to understand what's transpiring or likely to transpire in Alaska, we first need to understand the context, the history, which then allows us to more soberly review the facts. So first we could start with this. Historically, Russians have viewed their American counterparts as naive. So look at Yalta in 1945. Stalin maneuvered Roosevelt into dividing Europe while presenting an image of unity. In 1985, Gorbachev used Geneva with Reagan to rehabilitate Moscow's image during unprecedented economic and military weakness back in the Soviet Union. In 2001, Vladimir Putin charmed George W. Bush, buying time for military modernization and internal consolidation before finally showing aggression when he invaded Georgia illegally in 2008, a country that Russia still occupies 20% of today. So, U.S. presidents universally go from Clinton to Bush to Obama, and now Trump have sought to improve bilateral relations with Russia. Each one of those presidents believed that they had unique insight on how to fix the relationships with Moscow, how to succeed where their predecessors had failed. And now, the Alaska venue, it tilts the field before the talks even begin. So the U.S. has chosen a military base, which makes a lot of sense. It's well controlled, there's security cameras, there's security everywhere, and the media access is also controlled. Now, though Vladimir Putin will be on U.S. territory, on our soil, he realizes something else. He is a KGB trained operative. This gives him an advantage because though he's not playing on his home court, he will seek to take advantage of the US president's presumed comfort of being on a US military base. From there, he'll seek to stroke his ego. He'll seek to use vanity to gain political advantage. Now, in order to achieve this, Putin's going to rely on a lot of different psychological tricks, psychological operations, because that's what he always does. So let's look back really quickly. Look at the first meeting in 2001 between Vladimir Putin and George W. Bush. During that meeting, George W. Bush, who is known to be an evangelical Christian, was approached by Putin, and Putin told him a story. Putin said that in the early 1990s, while working for the KGB still, his mother had given him a small Orthodox cross. According to Putin, he had had that cross blessed in Jerusalem, and he added this spiritual layer to himself, trying to show that he was very similar to Bush himself. Now, according to Putin, years later, at his dacha near St. Petersburg, a fire broke out. He said that he rushed inside to the dacha to save some belongings, but during the course of everything, he lost track of this cross. According to Putin, hours later, a firefighter allegedly approached him and handed him the cross, saying that it had been found in the wreckage of the house, in the ashes, undamaged. Now, Vladimir Putin told Bush that that incident had convinced him to never again take off the cross. The anecdote resonated with Bush, a man of strong Christian faith, and he was likely told the story by Putin to specifically create strong personal rapport. But critics, myself included, point out that the story structure feels almost too cinematic. It suggests that, in fact, it's not a true story, but a political tool. And in fact, years later, Bush brought up the story in a follow-up meeting with Putin. And he asked him, "So where's your cross?" Putin didn't have it with him, which sort of undermines his earlier claim. This inconsistency has fueled skepticism with many other Kremlin watchers than just myself about whether Putin's religious presentations are in fact genuine or just calculated for political gain. And in fact, it seems that George W. Bush realized his mistake because 7 years later, after Russia invaded Georgia, he ran into him on the same day, hours later, on August 8th, 2008, at the Beijing Olympics. And during their encounter, he told Putin to his face that he was, quote, cold-blooded. But the timing underscored the shift in Bush's views from personal trust to open distrust. But this highlights something that's been going on for more than 20 years. Putin's psychological tactics extend, though, far beyond just Bush. Look back in 2006, during U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice's visit to the Kremlin. Putin allowed his large black Labrador, Connie, to enter the meeting room. Now, Dr. Rice was not somebody known to have a fear for dogs. However, the sudden presence of this large, energetic animal broke the standard protocol. It shifted the dynamics in the room because Putin was totally comfortable with his large dog, but his opponent was not. This was all meant to give him an advantage. It was a subtle assertion of control in the middle of formal diplomacy. Now, Putin himself has before said that Connie, his large black female dog, was named after Condoleezza Rice. And incredibly enough, to show you the way that Putin thinks, he introduced them to each other. Now, that dog has also played other roles in Putin's psychological operations during diplomacy. In 2007, Putin used Connie again, this time in the high-profile meeting with German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Merkel was well known for her fear of dogs. She'd been bitten as a small child. So Putin arranged for Connie to be present during their talks in Sochi, allowing the animal to come up and start sniffing Merkel. So Merkel tried to maintain composure in front of the cameras, but it was quite obvious that she was totally uncomfortable. The moment was quite obviously intended to intimidate Angela Merkel. The dog incident, though, just reinforces what we already knew. Putin has a reputation for using personal vulnerabilities as leverage in diplomatic settings. This is a pattern throughout Putin's life. He seeks to charm to lower the defenses, but then he also uses calculated aggression when the target is most vulnerable. Vladimir Putin refers to himself as being a, quote, specialist in human relations. But you have to understand, in KGB terms, human relations means manipulation. It does not mean rapport. He studies leaders. He looks for their weaknesses. He tests their reactions. He uses silence, stares, staged anecdotes. And that's sort of why Vladimir Putin, as a rule, he much favors informal exchanges over formal negotiation. Because when it's informal, off the cuff, he can see the unguarded moments, and he can then steer the person towards his objectives. He does this all the time using flattery, selective intelligence sharing, and controlled tension in order to shift the psychological balance in the room. Now, today it's clear that Ukraine is going to be sidelined. Putin rejects any format where Zelensky would be involved, which sort of just revives the Soviet practice of deciding a nation's fate without allowing that nation to be present. Undoubtedly, he will come up with some sort of a proposal, a Minsk II style peace plan, where they will undoubtedly call for elections before they even get around to restoring security. And Ukraine will correctly reject this, which will then allow Vladimir Putin to claim that Ukraine, not Russia, is blocking the peace. The fight today, though, is over perception. It's not over policy. Soviet and Russian strategy relies on these optics, on this perception of parity, of two leaders, two flags, implying equal say in world affairs. Even in strategic weakness, that image undercuts the narrative of Russia in isolation. And right now, we see that the Russians are picking up their game. In this pre-summit phase, they're already using pressure. Moscow is pairing its military activities in eastern Ukraine with what it claims are Ukrainian attempts to derail the attacks. It's doing everything it can now in order to discredit Ukraine before these meetings in Alaska. So we have to understand that domestic politics are inseparable from foreign policy. The Kremlin amplifies external threats in order to justify repression and also to rally support, something it needs so desperately now that the economic situation and the military situation for Russia is so desperate. Russian state media will undoubtedly present any meeting that comes as proof of Putin's enduring global relevance. And the outcome of Alaska ultimately will be used by the Russians to call for another meeting, one to be held on Russian soil. Because if Putin gains even a symbolic concession, Russian state media will declare that there is a new Moscow-Washington axis. And if he leaves without a deal, with nothing, well, they will say that he projected strength because he was able to meet at parity with the U.S. leader. So at this point, it's unclear what will happen. But we have to understand very clearly that for Vladimir Putin, this is not about diplomacy. This is a battle of narratives. This is a battle for strategic pressure. And in the minds of this KGB officer, victory lies not in the communique that will come from this, but in shaping what the world believes happened behind those closed doors. Thank you for watching. Please like this video. Please subscribe to this channel. And as always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.